Old Time Tales presents A Tale of Two Cities, a film strip flashback. Enjoy the show.
A Tale of Two Cities. The great English novelist Charles Dickens wrote often and strongly against social injustice. The England in which he lived was in many ways very like the France he wrote about in A Tale of Two Cities. Today we tend to forget that he wrote this dramatic work as a warning and a plea to his own nation, as well as a vivid and chilling description of the results of man's inhumanity to man in the nation just across the English Channel. Dickens begins A Tale of Two Cities with, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the year of our Lord, 1775. A lonely old man waited in an attic above a wine shop in Paris. A pathetic creature, trembling and afraid, he did not remember who he was, where he'd been, or how he came to the attic. In the room was a cobbler's bench and tools where he made shoes when he felt strong enough. The door was kept locked, not because he was a prisoner, but because he was afraid when the door was opened. Thus, it was kindness that kept it locked, not cruelty. The wine shop was owned by Madame Defarge and her husband. Located in the poor quarter of Paris, it was the secret meeting place for a strange group of men who spoke in whispers against the king and queen and the harsh treatment of the French people by the aristocracy. As the head of this group, Monsieur Defarge, along with his wife, a bitter and disillusioned woman, dreamed and plotted to free France from the tyranny of the nobility. Day after day, Madame Defarge sat outside the wine shop, knitting a long scarf. Although she spoke little, she saw and heard everything that went on. Each story of injustice, each name of an oppressor of the people was recorded by her, for she knitted the names into her scarf using symbols. So over the years, the scarf grew longer and longer. Dr. Manette, the old man in the attic, had been a prisoner in the Bastille for 18 years. Until then, he had had a thriving career as a doctor. Suddenly and without warning, the doctor had mysteriously vanished one day into the black horrors of the believing her father as well as her mother dead. But after all these years, the bank had traced Dr. Manette. On his release from prison, he stayed with his former servant, Ernest Defarge, while Madame Defarge tended him, slowly nursing him back to health. So as soon as arrangements could be completed, Jarvis Lorry, a friend of Dr. Manette, brought Lucie to his attic. In a heartbreaking scene of love and pain, Lucie cradled the broken man in her arms. Weeping, she promised to take care of him. Then, bidding a grateful farewell to the Defarges, Lorry, who besides being a friend was an official of Tellson's Bank, and Lucie took Dr. Manette back to England. There they settled down to a quiet life as the doctor gradually recovered and resumed the practice of medicine. Although he suffered an occasional relapse, their story seemed to have a happy ending. But it was only beginning. 5 years later, Lucie and her father sat in the courtroom of Old Bailey, London's most infamous jail. The Manettes had been called as witnesses in an unusual case involving a young man who had been a passenger on their boat trip back from France to England. They had not seen or heard of him since. The young man, Charles Darnay, was on trial on charges of treason. Several witnesses appeared against him, including one singularly unpleasant man named John Barsad, who accused Darnay of smuggling information about English army movements in America to 2 Frenchmen. Things were decidedly going against Darnay. Then suddenly, after a whispered conference with his assistant, Mr. Stryver, the prisoner's counsel, pointed to another man in the courtroom. It was none other than Stryver's own assistant, who until that minute had kept well out of sight. The man, Sidney Carton, resembled Darnay so closely that legal identification was impossible. Stryver concluded that if Barsad could not tell these two men apart, perhaps he had mistaken Darnay for someone else in the first place. The courtroom buzzed with surprise. As a result of this unusual resemblance, Darnay was acquitted. Lucie, quite drawn to the young man, wished him well, and with her father's permission, invited him to visit them soon. To celebrate the acquittal, Darnay and Sidney Carton went out to dinner together. However, they almost quarreled, for each was interested in Lucie Manette. After Darnay left, Carton sat alone for a long time, drinking and brooding over his unhappy life. Sidney Carton was a heavy drinker. Although a brilliant lawyer, he had long ago lost interest in bettering himself. For as long as he earned enough money to buy liquor, he was content to write the briefs that Stryver presented in court. But upon meeting Lucie, a strange unrest took hold of Carton, and he decided to see her again. Lucie and her father lived in a small house near Soho Square in London. It was a happy, peaceful home which centered around the care and devotion of Lucie and the doctor for each other. In addition, there was Miss Pross, a devoted maid, and Mr. Lorry to look after them. But two outsiders were forcing their way into this tight circle. In the weeks following the trial, Darnay and Carton often visited the Manettes. While Dr. Manette liked them both, he reacted to each differently. Toward Carton, he felt pity and would have liked to help him, whereas Darnay had impressed the doctor. Lucie, too, favored Darnay. To his new friends, Darnay was a young man earning a modest living teaching French to English children. Little did they suspect that there was more to young Darnay than what appeared on the surface. Meanwhile, in France, events occurred which angered the people. Unrest and threats of an uprising were everywhere, as the people, starving and crushed unmercifully under the heels of a brutish and inhuman aristocracy, began to rebel. One particularly horrible incident had the poor people of Paris up in arms. It seems the Marquis Saint Evrémonde had killed the child of a peasant while driving his carriage. The incident took place in front of the wine shop of Monsieur Defarge. As payment for the child's life, the Marquis had tossed a gold coin to the father. But as the carriage drove off, the heartbroken man leaped on the back of the carriage and hid under the springs. That night, Darnay, a nephew of the Marquis, was in Paris visiting his uncle. The two men quarreled bitterly. In particular, Darnay argued with his uncle about the injustices being committed against the French people. Because he loathed what was happening, he had left his native land originally. Now he was renouncing his interest in the family estates. Under the circumstances, he would rather be a poor man in a free country than the richest noble in France. The Marquis haughtily refused to listen. That night, he was murdered while asleep. Pinned to his pillow was a cryptic note: "Drive him fast to his tomb. This from Jacques." Jacques was the secret password used by the group of revolutionaries headed by Defarge. A year passed before the father of the dead child was captured for the murder. The story of his hideous punishment spread throughout the country. He was tortured, then hanged in chains and left to rot just above the drinking fountain of the Marquis's village, as a warning to others who defied the nobility. Darnay knew nothing of these events because he had left his uncle's home the night before the murder to return to London to secure Dr. Manette's permission to marry Lucie. On hearing the news of his uncle's death, the new Marquis Saint Evrémonde wrote to Gabelle, the steward of the Evrémonde estates, telling him to divide the land among the peasants on the estate as payment for centuries of harsh, tyrannical Evrémonde rule. He himself would not return to France. His work, his heart, and his beliefs kept him in England. With Dr. Manette's consent, Darnay proposed to Lucie, who agreed to marry him. Her acceptance, Lucie knew, would be a bitter disappointment to Sidney Carton, for he had appeared at her home late one night. Almost overcome by emotion, Carton confessed his enduring love for Lucie. In the same breath, he said that he realized that there was no hope for him. He was beyond help, and because of the way he had thrown his life away, he would never ask Lucie to marry him. Yet he would be her truest friend on earth. The time will come when new ties will form around you, he said. Think now and then that there is a man who would give his life to keep a life you love beside you. Lucie, deeply touched, had promised never to reveal his secret. A few weeks later, Lucie and Darnay were married. The years passed happily, and true to his word, Carton remained an unobtrusive but ever-present companion to the entire family, which soon included a little girl named Lucie. There had been a son, but he had died while quite young. Darnay had all but forgotten his native land until, a few years later, in 1789, the French people stormed the Bastille, symbol of tyranny and enslavement. During the next 3 years, many felt the anger of the mob as it swept all Paris, then all France, along in an ever-increasing bloodbath of horror and vengeance. These events soon threatened the happiness of Lucie, Darnay, Dr. Manette, and their friend Sidney Carton. For one day, Darnay received a letter from an old servant in prison in Paris, begging him to save his life. It was from Gabelle, the steward Darnay had entrusted with freeing the peasants on his estates. With the coming of revolution in France, the peasants had burned the estates and manor house to the ground and thrown Gabelle into prison. By writing to Darnay, he unknowingly placed Darnay, as one of the hated nobility, within the grasp of the new Revolutionary Tribunal. Madame Defarge long ago had knitted the name Evrémonde into her register of revenge. After he received the letter, Darnay left immediately to help the man. Darnay went to Paris, where he was arrested as an undesirable emigrant. With hatred and contempt, the revolutionaries dragged him off to the prison of La Force. When word of this disaster reached them, Dr. Manette and Lucie hastened to Paris. Because of the doctor's influence as a former prisoner in the Bastille, Darnay was saved from being taken out without trial and murdered, along with dozens of other prisoners, by the angry populace. But the doctor was not able to free his son-in-law. Thus began a time of terror and of endless waiting for Lucie and little Lucie. 1 year and 3 months later, Darnay was tried by the Revolutionary Tribunal. By appealing to the people, Dr. Manette again saved Darnay, but Madame Defarge was dissatisfied with the verdict. So that night, Darnay was arrested again. To the family's great shock and terror, Madame Defarge told the court that this time she had proof of the prisoner's crimes against the French people, and that her only witness against Darnay was Dr. Manette himself. Madame Defarge showed papers found in Dr. Manette's cell when the Bastille had been stormed. Her own husband had fought his way to 105 North Tower and unearthed the documents from its hiding place in the chimney. The doctor had written that one of the Evrémondes had caused his arrest. According to the document, the dead Marquis and his brother had dishonored, then murdered various members of a certain family of peasants in 1757. They had called upon the doctor to treat the only remaining members, a dying girl and her brother. When they too died, the Evrémondes had had the doctor consigned to prison in order to silence him forever. Dr. Manette ended his frightful account by writing, "Them and their descendants to the last of their race, I, Alexander Manette, unhappy prisoner, denounce to the times when all these things shall be answered for. I denounce them to heaven and earth." As a result, Darnay was tried for the crime of his ancestors and sentenced to the guillotine. Meanwhile, Sidney Carton, catching sight of a seemingly familiar face in the courtroom, followed the man to a small tavern. It was John Barsad, the same Barsad who had once denounced Darnay for treason at the Old Bailey. A turncoat, he was now working for the revolutionary government, but Carton suspected him of still being in the pay of the English. By threatening to denounce Barsad if he refused to help him, Carton was able to devise a wild plan to save Darnay from death. Within hours, Sidney Carton gained admittance to Darnay's cell. Once there, Carton drugged Darnay and had him carried out of the cell. Barsad, keeping his end of the bargain, pretended to the guards that it was Carton that he carried, quite drunk and overcome with emotion, on visiting his friend under such sad circumstances. Actually, Carton remained in the cell. His resemblance to Darnay prevented the discovery of Darnay's escape. The next morning, he, along with several other victims, was loaded into the wooden tumbrils and carted off to the guillotine. According to the escape plans Carton had made with Jarvis Lorry, the Manette family was outside the prison in a carriage when Barsad, with the limp Darnay, exited from the prison. After a nerve-wracking flight from Paris, Lucie and Darnay returned safely to England. True to his old promise to Lucie, Sidney Carton died on the guillotine, giving his life to save the happiness of his friends, thereby finding at last the peace of mind and pride in himself that he had never had in his lifetime. As he ascended the steps to the guillotine, he thought to himself, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known."
The end. Hey folks, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Cheers.